Thank you all for tuning in. Welcome to Understanding Bitcoin for Everyone. This series is designed to be an educational course on Bitcoin that is intended to be accessible by everyone, regardless of your current knowledge or technical background. This course is completely free. It will not be politicized, financialized, corporatized, or compromised by special interests or groups. Please enjoy this sponsor and ad-free experience. I'm going to make the best effort to be as unbiased as possible and present the information and facts only on how Bitcoin works in this course. I will not be 100% successful, as I clearly care enough about Bitcoin to make this course, so a little bias is unavoidable. I ask that you pay close attention and think for yourself when that bias surfaces. This course, the slides, and references/citations are all linked in the description below. I strongly encourage viewers to check my work and correct me where I am wrong so that I can make the content better for the next viewer. All right, well, welcome to Chapter 1. In this chapter, we're going to be going over a brief history of some of the attempts at making digital money or internet money before the inception of Bitcoin. I want to bring you up to speed real quick by briefly going through some of these older technologies and highlighting what innovations these attempts brought and what were some of the lessons learned. We're going to take a look at the early history of Bitcoin as well, some of the evolutions and eras that it went through in its early and defining years, and reflect briefly on what it looks like today as of making this course. All right, our first look at digital currency and cryptocurrency goes as far back as 1983, when David Chaum published his proposal of eCash. This was pretty ahead of its time, as it wouldn't be until 1998 that the next digital money with cryptography built directly into the architecture would be proposed. David Chaum was an American computer scientist, cryptographer, and the inventor of eCash. eCash was an anonymous, cryptographic electronic money that would be cryptographically signed and verified by a bank and could be stored locally on a user's computer. eCash was actually implemented and tested in the Mark Twain Bank of St. Louis, Missouri. In 1998, eCash actually became available in various places around the world, like Switzerland, Germany, Australia, and Japan. eCash would eventually fail, though, because the company it was trademarked under, DigiCash, went bankrupt due to being outperformed by the adoption of credit cards. As far as we know, this project started it all and was the first attempt at digitizing money. And it was a pretty good first attempt given how young the idea was at the time. This is back before credit card payments online were a thing, before PayPal, etc. David tackled double spending, which is a concept that is crucial to all forms of digital money, albeit with methods that would still need to be approved upon. And we'll touch more on the double spending problem in the next chapter and what it really is and how it affects digital money. It was pretty impressive that eCash had as much implementation as it did, all things considered. A core lesson learned here with eCash was its centralization. Its success as a currency depended heavily on the success of DigiCash, the holding company, which, of course, failed. So everything under it, including eCash, failed with it. All right, next up is Douglas Jackson and eGold. In 1996, Douglas Jackson brought about eGold, a digital form of gold currency to be used on his website, which allowed users to buy and sell online with digital currency backed by physical gold. Douglas Jackson was an early and minor participant in the early days of the cypherpunks. For those who don't know, the cypherpunks was sort of a cultural movement based around individuals or groups promoting the use of privacy tools enforced by cryptography for political and social activism or change. He was allegedly familiar with the space, but hadn't really fully adopted or participated in a lot of the ideologies. His main goal was to learn how to implement SSL into his website to secure eGold's transactions. Douglas left his oncology profession to start eGold. eGold would go on to gain a lot of adoption, having over 1 million active accounts in 2004. eGold eventually ran into some legal trouble, though. The service started to be used by criminals of multiple trades, including hackers, money launderers, pornographers, identity theft, fraud, etc. Egold was indicted in 2007 on these charges and pled guilty in a plea bargain to the operation of an unlicensed money transmission service and conspiracy to engage in money laundering. Although Jackson faced a maximum of 20 years in prison, he was instead sentenced to 300 hours of community service and roughly $2,500 in fines. And he was actually allowed to continue operating his business so long as they required customers to comply with Know Your Customer verifications. Although Egold was allowed to operate and Jackson was able to move on with that very lenient sentence from the judge, they did cease operations in 2013. And in an interview, Douglas Jackson claimed that this was because the business was unable to get the proper licensure because of the previous criminal convictions. The full interview, by the way, is quite interesting and it's linked in the reference pages, so definitely check out the description below to listen to that full interview. All right, so the contributions here with Egold were mainly that this was a currency intended to be used on the internet from the beginning, not just banks, as we had talked about with eCash previously. There was a pretty novel idea to back it by gold, which makes it pretty unique. The project struggled to solidify itself in the competition for digital currency at the end, though, due to it being an entirely trust-based system, not only with the transactions, but the business itself that it was held under. On top of that, it was a currency that competed with a national currency or a nation-state currency, aka the US dollar, without having any authority or decentralization to keep it alive. It also suffered from pretty ambiguous redemption policies, reports of people having issues redeeming their e-gold for their physical gold when it was time to cash out. All right, our next contender on the scene is Adam Back with Hashcash. Hashcash was originally intended to be a solution for email spam and denial of service attacks, and it used a concept known as proof of work to accomplish this. Hashcash, say Hashcash five times fast. Hashcash outlined very clearly how the proof of work mechanism was to be implemented, and Satoshi actually cited it in the Bitcoin white paper, and it was actually implemented with some minor tweaks. Bitcoin would implement a dynamic difficulty curve for hashing instead of a fixed one, which was a key difference here. Adam Back is actually still active in the Bitcoin and crypto space as a CEO of Blockstream, a Bitcoin/cryptocurrency company that offers goods and services. They are becoming well known for their Blockstream Jade hardware wallet, which I'll actually allude to in a later chapter. All right, the main contribution or to take away from Hashcash is the proof of work mechanism. Hashcash basically solved the problem of threat mitigation and decentralization at the same time by outlining in great detail how proof of work architecture could be implemented. It only received minor tweaks in its implementation in Bitcoin. It was built mainly for the email framework that it was designed to protect from denial of service attacks and spam. It would end up needing other components added to it if it was to function as an actual digital internet currency. But these functions were added and implemented in Bitcoin, which we're coming up here on shortly. All right, next is B-Money, developed by Wei Dai, a Chinese computer engineer from the University of Washington with some notable accomplishments in cryptography and computer science. In 1998, Wei Dai published his article B-Money, an anonymous distributed electronic cash system, which outlined the schematic for how a cryptocurrency might work so that it would become money which is impossible to regulate. The article for B-Money is in the references, so please check that out if you're interested. The paper defines foundational concepts in it like nodes, smart contracts, and how to cryptographically secure transactions, and how to mint the digital money. Satoshi was actually in contact with Wei Dai and used some of these concepts to help build Bitcoin. Satoshi also credits B-Money and Wei Dai in the Bitcoin white paper. B-Money was peer-to-peer, which was a critical development in making the digital money decentralized, which is in turn sort of a critical development in having it be successful, as we'll touch on with Bitcoin here shortly. It also started defining ideas like smart contracts, which is a concept still used today, if not as much in Bitcoin as it is in other cryptocurrencies. For example, Ethereum is a big user of smart contracts. The lessons learned here, though, is that it was not fully decentralized and still relied on a central authority for minting and difficulty adjustments. This was outlined in the paper, which again is linked in the citations. You can go ahead and read that. Wadai describes a system where you would manually increase or decrease the difficulty based off of sort of his own idea of economics and what a market should look like, which isn't a super great system, which is why it never really took off. All right, next on the scene is Nick Szabo with BitGold. Nick Szabo is a computer scientist from the University of Washington as well, who is credited with the development of smart contracts, executable digital contracts on the internet that have a kind of binding and execution of real-world contract law. Now, smart contracts were touched on previously in B-Money, but they weren't fully defined. Nick would go on to better define them and implement them in his proposal for BitGold. In 1998, he designed a proposed BitGold, which was a blueprint for digital currency that was never implemented, though, but is considered to be the precursor or foundation of the Bitcoin architecture. On December 27th, 2008, Nick published an article outlining the BitGold architecture. Unique to BitGold was the Byzantine fault-tolerant public registry. And he also pivoted away from BitGold and Bitcoin shortly after Bitcoin's release and speaks to other projects and cryptocurrencies in the space. The main innovations here were the Byzantine fault-tolerant public registry. This was a method of essentially verifying honest votes to reach a unanimous consensus. But essentially, the Byzantine general's problem, to explain it briefly, is let's say you have 5 generals that are all spread evenly apart on a battlefield. And the idea is that they all need to agree to act on a plan because it's better for all of them to act in the same way, whether that be to attack or retreat, than for half of them to attack, half of the other half to retreat. So how do you get all 5 of them to communicate at once and reach the same consensus without there being miscommunications or corruption? His idea never made it into code, and they were never developed or tested, unfortunately. But only a year later, we would see the culmination of all of these efforts come together as Bitcoin would be released. 2009, Satoshi Nakamoto releases the Bitcoin white paper onto the world. Who was Satoshi Nakamoto? Well, we don't know. There are many theories or suspects out there. Some people believe it's a specific person. Some people believe it's a group of people. Nick Szabo is actually speculated very often of being Satoshi Nakamoto, as well as others that we talked about. Adam Back, Hal Finney is another one that we haven't mentioned, but he's also accused, or people claim that he is Satoshi Nakamoto. Several people have come forward claiming to be Satoshi. In all of these circumstances, though, as of the making of this course, there is no real evidence that identifies who Satoshi was. All right, Satoshi Nakamoto began writing the code for Bitcoin in 2007. On August 18th, 2008, Satoshi registered the domain bitcoin.org and created and hosted the website that still exists today on that domain. The Bitcoin white paper was released on October 31st, 2008, in response to the banking and economic turmoil in the United States, which also impacted the rest of the world. On the 9th of January, 2009, Nakamoto released version 0.1 of the Bitcoin software on SourceForge and launched the network by defining the genesis block of Bitcoin, that is block number 0, which had a reward of 50 Bitcoins. Satoshi maintained contact with the other developers for Bitcoin until roughly mid-2010. They continued to modify and change the Bitcoin source code while it was still feasible to do so, making optimizations and working out the bugs. He would then give control of the source code repository to Gavin Andresen, transfer domains like bitcoin.org to other members of the Bitcoin community at the time, and then would then disappear. Here is what the Bitcoin Genesis block looks like. This is just the raw data from the block. You can view this on any block explorer on the internet, or you can open it yourself if you have a copy of the Bitcoin software on your computer, which we'll talk more about that later, don't worry. But I wanted to outline this, that the source data inside of this block contains the Times, 3 January 2009, Chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks. Again, it's believed that Bitcoin was heavily inspired and released in response to the financial crisis that started in 2008 and would last a couple years. All right, and this is a screenshot of bitcoin.org. It's a website that still exists today. It's still owned by the co-owners, some of the original developers, which were originally selected by Satoshi. On their website, they mention that it's still an open source project ran by the community, and they do their best to keep it decentralized through public pull request process. That's GitHub language for sharing code with each other for those who are not super technical with code. And it's managed by the maintainers of that. All right, May 22nd, 2010, commonly referred to as Pizza Day for fans of Bitcoin or people in the cryptocurrency community. This is the suspected to be the first Bitcoin transaction for physical goods that took place. It took place in Florida, where a man paid another individual 10,000 Bitcoins to get him 2 large pieces from Papa John's, a transaction valuing roughly $25 at the time. In August of 2010, a major vulnerability in Bitcoin was identified. This was pretty significant. Essentially, if a transaction's output was large enough, it would overflow or go outside of the defined range of integers permissible and allowed the originator of that transaction to mint Bitcoins that didn't adhere to the intended limits of the software. So, again, for those who are not super technically inclined, it's basically just an exploit where you flood something with enough data that the boundaries sort of get crossed and you start being able to manipulate the software outside of those boundaries. So that's exactly what happened. The transaction spent half a Bitcoin to create over 92 billion Bitcoins, which is, of course, well over the 21 million Bitcoin cap that Bitcoin is infamous for. The vulnerability was caught within a few hours. A fix was implemented and the Bitcoin protocol underwent a soft fork. Bitcoin was forked from just before that transaction, so if you look at the blockchain now, it's as if it never took place. It's not included. This was the only major security flaw ever found and exploited in Bitcoin's history to date. All right, I want to bring up the Silk Road. It's not super related to Bitcoin, but it often gets associated with Bitcoin. So I wanted to touch on it for those who are curious. The Silk Road was a darknet market for illicit goods and services that launched in 2011. The site became infamous in the news and in nerdy spaces, especially after the apprehension of the alleged owner, Ross William Ulbricht, which is a fascinating story. You should definitely look into that if you have some time. But essentially, this sparked a lot of controversy and misconception that remains to this day regarding Bitcoin's utility as a tool for criminals and creeps, because it was the main currency used on the Silk Road. And Bitcoin is still used on the darknet even today, though not quite as much. And the statistics around what is used on the darknet would probably surprise you. I won't get into them in this course because it's not technically relevant, but Bitcoin is still used, but we're going to debunk some of the myths of what Bitcoin's intended use is for and who and what benefits from using Bitcoin. And I can tell you it's not drug dealers. All right, next up is a pretty crucial part of Bitcoin's history, known as the block size wars. You might have heard of this, you might not have. It started in 2010 essentially, when Satoshi added to the Bitcoin code a 1 megabyte size limit for each block. We will be discussing this in greater detail about blocks and megabytes and some of the more technical stuff. I'll break that down in a very easy to digest way. Um, but Satoshi never provided a formal reason for making this change, and it was speculated that it was to keep the blockchain um, small, impose a size limit that would keep the blockchain small and allow your average person to continue mining and storing the blockchain on whatever consumer grade electronics were available in the market. Um, this in turn would be a trade off that meant transactions would be slower and more expensive, though. So, two groups of thought emerged from this in 2015 as Bitcoin started to become more popular. The two groups are big blockers and small blockers. So, the big blockers believe that the Bitcoin source code should be changed to increase the block size limit. This idea was that it would make the Bitcoin more scalable, accessible, and increase its adoption. Proponents argue that the code could just be rolled back later if needed be, and would allow for scalability solutions to be developed in the meantime, which is true and untrue in some ways. Again, we'll talk about how Bitcoin's code can be changed, but the enormous amount of effort that is required for that to happen. Small blockers wanted to keep the Bitcoin source code the same and keep the 1 megabyte block size limit. Their idea was that this limit was the mechanism that would keep the entire blockchain accessible and decentralized. Again, the reason further behind that is that if the Bitcoin blockchain is small, anybody can download the full blockchain, run a node on any piece of hardware they have lying around, and participate in the consensus of Bitcoin. In 2017, the community had spoken and the 1 megabyte limit was to remain. The Bitcoin blockchain was hard forked into Bitcoin Cash, which had a block limit of 8 megabytes that would increase as time went on. And quickly to explain what forking means, forking just means that you take the code that you were using and you make a change to it, and it's a big enough change to where it becomes something else. So in this case, we're talking about a hard fork. So Bitcoin as code, they want to add the 8 megabyte limit. So it forks to the left, it becomes Bitcoin Cash. That's a completely different blockchain now, and it's not interoperable. And those Bitcoin that are created on that blockchain don't have any effect on the Bitcoin blockchain. The original Bitcoin blockchain later adopted segregated witness, SegWit for short, through a user activated soft fork. So you can think of a soft fork as it's still Bitcoin. The Bitcoin generated on SegWit is still fungible with the Bitcoin generated on just regular Bitcoin. However, people can choose whether or not to run the Bitcoin SegWit version or just the regular Bitcoin version. SegWit was a compromise to speed up transactions and reduce blockchain bloat without changing the block size. This was accomplished by taking the data, specifically the unlocking signature or the witness data, and moving it from transactions into a separate part of the blockchain structure. All right, so what's going on along the way here? Bans and adoption. Well, I'm sure you've probably heard plenty of news titles, headlines, articles saying all kinds of things about Bitcoin. Bitcoin has been banned and restricted and scrutinized by many countries all over the world. You mainly hear about this from China, but it's been banned and restricted in places like Qatar and Saudi Arabia. But it's also been embraced around the world. Countries like El Salvador actually made Bitcoin legal tender in 2021. Plenty of places in the United States, Europe, and all around the world, Australia, have Bitcoin ATMs where people can trade their currency for Bitcoin. Things have developed on top of Bitcoin, like the Lightning Network, which we'll touch on probably in a separate course that deserves its own course, I believe. And businesses are accepting Bitcoin all around the world as well. You can pay for services, you can buy Steam games with Bitcoin. Certain countries have local shops that'll accept Bitcoin. Online merchants like Amazon will sometimes, depending on where you are, accept Bitcoin, etc. All right, so I wanted to throw up some metrics on the Bitcoin network, just to give an idea of where we're at today, where we've been, and what's going on with the network. So as you can see, as time goes on, the hash rate or the mean hash rate has continued to rise. You can think of the hash rate as the difficulty of what it takes to mine the Bitcoin to get the Bitcoin reward. And this is a function of the energy that's being put into the network and how much difficulty curve is being implemented at this time. So as you can see, it continues to get more and more difficult, which means the network has continued to actually gain adoption and be used, because the more it's used, the more difficult it is to mine those Bitcoins. All right, so our next graph shows the number of Bitcoin transactions. As we can see, as time goes on, it tends to trend upwards, having some spikes and some troughs based off of the hype around the price. Typically is where you see these spikes. People probably selling all of their Bitcoin or buying Bitcoin. And during these doldrums where the price is sort of flatline or going sideways, the transaction counts tend to be a little lower. But as we can see, general from 2011 to where we're at today, general move towards the upside. More transactions are happening, which means more people are using the network. This huge spike at the end there, I'm not sure if that is an error on Glassnode's website. I like Glassnode, by the way. I'm not trying to throw shade at them. I just don't know if that's accurate or not. It seems like a bit of anomaly. I know Bitcoin had a transaction flood of sorts about a month ago, so that could be what that is representing. Basically, like a bunch of bots were doing a ton of transactions on Bitcoin and trying to slow it down, which it did slow down a bit, but obviously it's still kicking. So I think that's what that is attributed to, but I could be wrong. All right, so our next metric is number of active addresses. You can think of this as a metric for the activity on the network, purely from the user's side, how many people have addresses that they're continuing to send and receive from. This isn't a perfect metric, as we'll discuss how addresses used to work, and how they work now. Generally speaking, new addresses are formed every time you do any transaction. That is the optimal way to transact on Bitcoin. But for the most part, a lot of people still reuse addresses, which is fine. And this is what this is tracking. So as we can see, lots of spikes and lots of dips, but generally a move towards the upside with a lot of activity continuing to grow. Another metric was just the Bitcoin search term on Google, just to see where it's at. Again, starting from 2009, not super searched. And we go through these periods where it'll spike up tremendously. People want to know what this stuff is. And then the interest fades, and then it spikes, and then it fades. Overall, general trend upwards, it seems, with, again, pretty dramatic swings that I would be very willing to bet match up with price swings. As people, when Bitcoin hits 68,000, people are Googling and they're curious about it because the news is covering it, and then they forget. So pretty cool metric here. Bitcoin is in the top 100, specifically the 75th spot of the most active and favorited repositories on GitHub. For those of you who aren't programmers, GitHub is just well, it's a lot of things, but primarily it's a tool for collaborating and versioning code and software. So you can store your code up there. It's like Google Cloud for documents, but for programmers. You put your code up there, and it's very easy to edit as a team, as a group, and to keep track of versions and keep track of who made edits and what edits were made and who's using different versions of your code and all that. So, very rudimentary description for those who aren't familiar. But it's extremely widely used in all development space. So to be in the top 100 of active repositories on GitHub is quite an achievement, especially 14 years after it was released. All right, so that pretty much wraps up chapter 1. Quick summary, quick wrap up. We looked at some previous iterations that paved the way for Bitcoin. eCash, BitGold, BMoney, Hashcash. We explored a little bit of Bitcoin's history, and we reviewed some of Bitcoin's metrics to understand where it's at today. So I hope you all enjoyed that. What's next for this course? Well, up next is Chapter 2. In Chapter 2, we're going to be doing a deep dive into figuring out what Bitcoin really is by reading the Bitcoin white paper together. I will read with you the 9-page Bitcoin white paper so that we can learn how it works, and so I can explain concepts like transactions, blocks, and proof of work in an easy to understand way as we go along. If you learned something new today, consider donating a like or a share to help pass the knowledge on. If you have any feedback or criticisms of the content in this course, please let me know in a comment below so I can fix it immediately. Thanks again for tuning in, and I'll see you in Chapter 2.